Ukrainian armed forces are pushing the Russians back in multiple places across the front line. Just why is Ukraine chosen now to push back on Russian forces? And is this a sign of Russian weakness, or are they just resting, preparing for the next assault? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is there's a whole bunch of crazy stories, actually, not many of which are not that great for old Russia. But I thought was most interesting is this here: Ukrainian defense forces regaining positions near Dachne, Vodiane Dru, and near Kruglenke. Now, bear in mind that Russian forces have also made advances in 3 locations. But what I thought was interesting is one takes place right here near Donetsk. And you can see that this is, again, a very limited attack, right? Significant only because it involves sort of crossing or repelling forces that cross this small set of rivers here. But what I think is most significant is, again, that not so much the gains themselves. You can see another one here, sort of south of Donetsk on kind of the northern end of Pokrovsk. And, of course, the last one near Kruglenke is actually, I think, most noteworthy because it is further expanding out this Kursk bridgehead. You can see here that while Russian forces make an advance pushing the Ukrainians likely over this river and marshland, the Ukrainians in turn have made some gains here near Mala Lokna. So kind of more of a trade-off than anything else. But what I think is significant is that it reflects a shift of Ukrainian priorities, right? And while, again, we've seen only defensive operations from Ukraine up until this point, they have been focused primarily on preserving their combat power. And the fact is that we've seen Russia over the last week or so diminish their total volume of assaults in the aggregate, which actually may be a function of a diminished recruiting pool for Russia. And so for Ukraine, what I think they don't want Russia to be able to do necessarily is simply pause their offensive and rebuild their troops to a larger push. While on one hand, I think actually for Ukraine, rebuilding their troops is going to be favorable to them. I think what they want to do is keep Russia on their toes and, more importantly, prevent Russia from occupying really critical junctures, right? And the reason I say this is because you can see in all the places that they've conducted these limited offensives, they involve sort of relieving pressure on Ukrainian forces, right? Note how, again, would you really want to be one of the Ukrainian troops in Malalakna or Pogrebki? You can see these are narrow fields of just around, I think, really only about 5 or 6 kilometers here from point to point. And these forces are likely have Russians on their north, east, and west. So for Ukraine, they likely said, listen, let's try to relieve the pressure on these guys by advancing in this westerly direction. Then you also, of course, have the same basic math taking place, again, outside Pokrovsk, right? You can see here that this is 2 offensive actions that are meant to prevent Russian forces from closing and encircling Pokrovsk, right? You can see Russian forces attempting likely to stage some kind of breakthrough here to put northern pressure on Pokrovsk, particularly along this major highway. This is likely helping to supply all of these defensive lines here. So for the Ukrainians, they likely said, listen, we've got to push the Russians out of these 2 sort of pincer areas because otherwise, right, the alternative routes are going to be very, very convoluted if you want to get from Sloviansk or Kramatorsk, right? You can see how just there's really not many like very stable high volume routes when you get from Kramatorsk to Konstantinivka and then continue south. So I think that's part of it. I think this is primarily focused on pressure relief in critical areas. You can see here, let's see. Yeah. And so I think this is sort of a reflection, not of a huge shift in Ukrainian priorities, right? They're not going to see a major Ukrainian breakthrough, but what you are seeing is a willingness by the Ukrainians to conduct localized offensives. And I think some of that is a function of improved Ukrainian tactics, right? They're more confident to do this because they have the ability to conduct less personnel intensive assaults. And we're going to actually take a look at for the Ukrainians the first time they conducted a all drone assault, right? And before we talk about that, though, of course, I want to mention that if you want to see the latest in Ukrainian drone tactics, you want to get that on combatvetnews.com. This is my answer to Patreon. This is the largest archive of combat footage, uncensored stuff YouTube will not let me show you. Probably on maybe the whole internet, but I do a breakdown every Tuesday and Thursday of the latest combat footage coming to you from the front lines. So become a member, right? And it supports me. You know, I don't get that many sponsors, and I definitely don't partner with major media outlets or major governments, right? And that's one of the reasons that, you know, I am so. That's why you don't see me, I think, on a lot of podcasts or on a lot of these other kind of media outlets. Not because I hate it or whatever, but because literally I don't think they want me on there because I don't really toe any lines. But the reason I can be independent is because you guys have my back. So if you want to support me, combatvetnews.com. Link is in the description, right? So check it out. Okay. So this is what I want to point out is that Ukraine is looking for ways to make its tactics more efficient. Ukraine has a lot of money and a good amount of material resources, but what it doesn't have is personnel. And so they are always looking for ways to spare and preserve their personnel. And the most prominent of which is, of course, in this all-drone assault, right? And what made it fascinating is this profile here from the Kiev Independent of the first time an all-drone assault force attacked. And what's fascinating is that it combined a number of things that we've seen, trends we've seen emerging on the battlefield in the Ukrainian armed forces, right? FPV drones, reconnaissance drones, turret-mounted drones, and kamikaze ground drones, all working in unison on the ground and the air. Supposedly, the attack involved over 100 personnel, 30 of which were conducting drones. So this was the equivalent of about a platoon assault, right? And this is under the command of a young tech-savvy unit that they themselves say, listen, we are in the military, but we are not military in that way, right? We prefer to keep our command structures flat. Rank is more about what your check from the government is, but it's about technical prowess. It's about solving the problem. Again, they're a military unit that looks like a startup, and you can see they've got dozens of FPV drones ready to conduct this assault, bomber drones, recon drones. And as they point out that when they pitched this idea of an all-drone assault, there was a lot of skepticism. Most people thought that the Russians would simply jam the drones or blow them up before they ever made it. But in fact, the all-drone assault proved way exceeded expectations, right? Their metric for success was to simply have every drone make it to their designated target. If they're like, we can do that, that is success. Instead, the drones actually drove the Russians out of their positions, cleared the trenches, and then Ukrainian infantry came up and held the new positions. So this is a sign, again, that for Ukraine, now remember, they're using ground assault drones. They also have kamikaze ground drones, which I thought was fascinating and something we haven't seen yet in any of the publicly released footage, but they alluded to it here. Drones that simply probably drive into bunkers and blow themselves up. And all of this combined, right, it fulfills the most dangerous moment of an assault, which is where human beings cross open fields in front of and in full view of enemy positions, right? And if you can take this critical moment, the moment the tip of the spear enters the enemy, and you can outsource that onto machines, even if those machines are 80% or 70% as effective as a human being, you're still potentially going to have tremendous savings in terms of lives, right? Even if, again, you have the sort of breaking of the defense done by these assault drones, right? FPV drones, bomber drones, assault drones, just boom, 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 boom. And then all you do is break the defense and start to get a foothold, then you can have infantry follow behind and perform kind of the cleanup duties, right? But I think this kind of tactic is something we're seeing more and more. I think that's partially responsible for Ukraine's offensive successes. Again, limited though they are, I think it's a sign, again, that for Ukraine, they're finding ways to make this assault very, very efficient. And now remember, Russia is not going to take these lessons lying down. They are likely learning and adapting as well, and they're going to find ways to counter swarmed FPVs, swarmed drones on the ground and in the air. And they're still, the ground drones are still not really ready for prime time. There was at least one that got stuck in the mud. But again, this is something that potentially it could be solved with a question of scale or a question of, good reconnaissance or appropriate terrain. And the fact is, though, that even with this drone getting stuck, the mission was still a success. And guess what? That happens with missions with humans too, right? I can't tell you the number of times that we would have a vehicle breakdown mid-patrol, mid-operation when I was in Afghanistan, and you would just have to adapt, right? And I think that is not itself saying, it's like the self-driving cars, where people go, well, the self-driving cars had an accident, so therefore they must be fundamentally flawed. And you're like, well, no, human beings have accidents all the time. So the standard is not no more accidents. The standard is fewer accidents than a person. And that's sort of the mentality for ground assaults, right? Again, you might say, this all-drone assault in this location, it failed. You go, well, human assaults fail all the time. So the question is, are they more effective or are they less costly in terms of lives? Now, for Russia, a fully automated Skynet battlefield isn't their only nightmare. In fact, Russia's Shadow Fleet, these are fleets of tankers of unclear origin who are hauling Russian oil to sell illegally or in violation of international sanctions, right? And supposedly the Russian media even admitted that a foreign registered tanker called the Koala, carrying 1,300 tons or 130,000 tons of fuel oil, was damaged in a Russian port, which is an unusual admission, right? Russian media saying, basically, this tanker was violating sanctions. It was flagged under Antigua and Barbuda. Yep, it was good old tiny island nations always find a way to make a little money here and there, and was carrying a lot of tons of fuel oil, again, bound for some sort of sanction violating country. Supposedly, there was a host of explosions that took place in the engine room on Thursday, and that while there were no casualties, including a 24-man crew that was 4 Russians, 8 Georgians, and 12 Indonesians, Russia said there was no casualties. That's probably true. The blast did not cause a spill of the cargo or leak oil products, but that the ship may not be functional, and that's one less ship in Russia's Shadow Fleet, which I think is really interesting, that this has been slowly attrited, and it's not 100% clear who is involved, but pro-Kremlin media suggests that it was caused by a surface or underwater drone attack. Now, Ukraine's security services may have a key role in this, but you also have there's no shortage of people who want to see this Shadow Fleet destroyed. Ukraine, first and foremost, because it's a huge way that Russia funds its oil and sells its oil on the open market for roughly market prices. But the U.S. would also love to see this Shadow Fleet destroyed, and the EU would also love to see it destroyed, because these are all violating sanctions. And the more money Russia can make, the more money the West has to spend on arming and equipping Ukraine, and the harder it is to get Putin to the negotiating table. So everybody has an incentive to see the Russian economy get cut off from its lifeblood, which is literally oil. And again, there's going to be a limit, because remember, every time one of these ships gets sunk, that means that the next shipping company is going to say, listen, I'm not going to let you guys take my ship or my crew and put them in grave danger, as this sanction violating does, right? And you're going to see basically the same problem that Russia has with its current armed forces, where to attract people and ship owners to sell or turn over their ships to this operation and risk sanction themselves, Russia's going to have to pay them more and more and more. But because they're going to have to pay them more and more and more, guess what? That's going to eat away at the profits of this oil. And eventually it will actually probably get to a point where Russian oil is it's not any cheaper to circumvent the sanctions via ship than it is to just buy the sanctioned discounted oil. Now, does this mean that the Russian military is in full retreat? No. In fact, the Ukrainians are alleging that Russia is massing troops for new assaults near Chasiv Yar. Now, the problem for Russia is that, well, Ukraine obviously knows about it. And when Russia begins to concentrate troops for fresh assaults near Donetsk, well, it means that they can be targeted, right? And they say, again, there's a period of accumulation and concentration of Russian forces on the approaches to Chasiv Yar and regrouping in the town itself for further assault operations, right? And again, this means that, of course, Russia may still be preparing for assaults, but they may simply be of diminished character and capacity. And again, the Russians may not be able to conduct these kind of gradual assaults. Because remember, speed is an asset all its own. And the fact is that if Russia needs months to concentrate enough troops to conduct a major offensive, then that's going to be months that it takes the Ukrainians, where they can observe them, where they can use deep strikes like drones and HIMARS to attrit the Russian military in those concentrations. So what you have is increasingly this slower pace. Like, there's a point where operations are just too slow to be effective. Again, imagine if you were to clear a room, but you could only go at 1/4 speed. At some point, it wouldn't matter how sophisticated your room clearing tactics were if you're only moving at 1/4 speed of your potential adversary. They're going to come out on top no matter what you do. And that's kind of, I think, the goal for the Ukrainians, is to say, listen, we won't let Russia gather enough troops that they can overwhelm us. We're going to see them gather ahead of time. We're going to be prepared. We're going to attrit them down, and it's going to make the situation way worse. It's going to make it less likely to succeed. Again, sort of the reverse of the Ukrainian 2023 counteroffensive, where there was so much time spent consolidating, so many leaks of plans, that it didn't matter how effective the tactics were, because they were so slow and they were so telegraphed, there was never going to be any kind of chance of effectiveness. Now, two other notes I thought were significant that are worth talking about. The first of which is that actually the U.S. Army has begun to consult and talk to a lot of Ukrainian forces about the nature of the drone battlefield. And this is fascinating, right? It talks about actually a U.S. Army brigade deploying some pretty cutting edge technology like the Anduril Ghost X and several other sort of newly acquired systems. But more importantly, they are really consulting with the Ukrainians themselves about what it's like. One American colonel says, quote, "It's a transparent battlefield. That's why in Ukraine you see troops deep down in bunkers are constantly moving," right? You stop, you die. And the army is trying to make its units' footprints much smaller and more mobile, making them harder to target, right? And they say, okay, well, their headquarters, for example, changed position 4 times in 9 days, right? And no more than 20 personnel are in any headquarters at any one time, right? Again, a battalion headquarters would usually have up to 100 people, a brigade even larger than that, right? And of course, they say, I think the most important lesson is the speed where we need to change. And that's the other truth here. I think this is the real lesson, is that technology, just like in our lives, right? Look at the evolution of the smartphone from 2007 to today, right? It's a universe of difference, right? But look at even AI, right? In the last 24 months, we've seen huge leaps in AI. And the fact is that over 3 years of warfare, literally, if you could transport a soldier from 2022 to 2025, the war would be unrecognizable to them. The drones, the electronic warfare, the jamming, the internet, the Starlink, all of it, so advanced. And the Army's fundamental lesson is that they have to have nothing be sacred. Everything that they do, they have to be willing to abandon as soon as it becomes irrelevant. And I worry about the Army's ability to do that because they love tradition. They love their rigid chains of command. And at the end of the day, the more time senior officers spend with the doctrine first, by the book mentality, the harder those officers are going to have when it comes to game-breaking choices, right? Choices where they have to literally take even notions like rigid command or extremely rank pyramid stuff and throw them out the window. Again, look no further than this drone assault that was effectively run as a startup inside a defense inside the Ukrainian army. So can you imagine a colonel getting told by a private, hey, this isn't how we do this. This isn't going to work. This is stupid, right? But that's how you have to do when you run a startup. You have to have transparency. The other note that I thought was really significant, even though you may not realize it, Xi Jinping is going to attend Moscow's May 9th Victory Day parade, right? This is a huge deal because for both China and Russia, these victory parades, these major milestone events, the attendees and where they sit are symbols of the strength of that person's relationship. The closer they sit to sort of the superstar, the main honcho, right? In this case, Putin, the more favored those generals are generally seen as being. And so what you have is a really interesting dynamic where, one, you have Xi attending this, which is a symbol, I think, of his of the closeness of these two countries, right? They are two autocratic countries. They're dictatorships. They don't believe in free speech. They don't believe in democracy or people having a voice. And they are rooting for America and the American Western partnerships to fall apart, right? Because if independence and going it on your own and countries looking after themselves, if that was really of primacy and an extreme importance in the modern system, you wouldn't have these guys showing off how great of friends they are. So that should be, just file that in the back of your mind for future reference. Anyway, guys, that's really all I had. Thank you to James Sterling, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Alan Knutson, Bastian Himmeling, Brian Kelly, Del McCombs, James Alba, and Henry Roos here, all of our Lieutenant tier members. I'll see you guys tomorrow. We're going to drop some more footage from the front lines and some of the footage from some of these units. I appreciate you. Hit that subscribe button. See you in the next one. Cheers.